Go back then to that BBC story. And of course, this is not really going away for a number of reasons, but we know that the chairman has refused to resign. Some say he should stay, others that he should go. There is a bit of a split, we understand, on the BBC board after MPs heard of sharp differences in responding to those Telegraph revelations, which included the now infamous Panorama edit job. Let's have a listen to the chairman of the BBC speaking yesterday.
I think the real issue here was the impression left that the President Trump in his 6th of January speech had encouraged, called to violent action, and what we had to apologise for was that, as well as the splicing of the edit. It's my view that editing interviews is a normal journalistic practice. So that in itself is not what the problem was. The problem was the impression that it led, that it was an impression that President Trump had called for direct violent action, and that wasn't the case, and that is what I thought needed to be apologised for. So the answer to your question is, I didn't think it was adequate. I thought it was necessary but not sufficient.
The chairman of the BBC. Let's speak with Jonathan Lis, political commentator. Jonathan, good afternoon to you. I'm a bit confused about this whole story because I can't quite work out whether the BBC, based on some of the contributors yesterday at the Select Committee, stands accused of being a sort of a nest of right-wing dodgepots or a nest of left-wing dodgepots. How are you taking this?
Why not both, Doggiff? I don't know, Ian. I think that there are people at the BBC, such as Robbie Gibb, who I've met on a couple of occasions, and he is incredibly right-wing, and I don't think that he should be on a BBC or in a BBC role adjudicating impartiality.
What do you mean by incredibly right-wing? I mean, he worked for, as he said yesterday, it was 25 years at the BBC and less than 2 years working for Theresa May, who I don't think anybody would call incredibly right-wing. So where does that assessment
Well, she certainly wasn't. She certainly wasn't on the left.
No, she was a sort of centrist Tory, right?
She was. Well, I see you have a conversation about Theresa May's politics. I think
okay, well, let's concentrate on the central allegation that you made there. You said he's very right-wing. I don't know what that's based on.
I'm not going to repeat the content of conversations I've had with Robbie Gibb, but he is very right-wing in my experience of him.
Yeah, but in fairness, Jeremy Corbyn's very right-wing compared to you, Jonathan.
That's just not true in any sense, Ian. I mean, no one's ever, you're the first person ever to call me to the left of Jeremy Corbyn, for goodness sake. I thought we'd met on more than one occasion. You couldn't possibly think I was the left of Corbyn, but let's leave that to one side. I don't actually take your point particularly on that particular issue. Okay. But the fundamental point is that people such as Lewis Goodall, who is a friend of mine, and I respect him and I respect his integrity, he has gone on the record to say that Robbie Gibb had a personal campaign against him when he was at Newsnight, for example.
He was hired by Robbie Gibb.
He was... Look, there are people who have made all kinds of comments about the politics of those adjudicating impartiality. I think it's really important. Obviously, people will be entitled to have their political views. What I think is wrong is when, A, there's a conveyor belt or a revolving door between number 10 and the BBC, because that undermines confidence in the impartiality of the BBC. And second, when you have nakedly political actors who are appointed to positions high up in the BBC that are meant to be deciding on impartiality. I actually don't think, Ian, that the BBC is particularly left-wing or right-wing. I think that it has a deference towards power. And that for the most part, Britain is led by either small c or big C Conservative governments. Right now, we have a small c Conservative government. And so the BBC is deferential to that. And the BBC is naturally quite afraid of things. You occasionally see the BBC taking risks, and often it backfires. Remember the Andrew Gilligan affair of 2003, when the BBC went to war with the government under Tony Blair. And that was a very damaging episode for the BBC and for the government, it turned out. Yeah. But so what you have is, in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, you do have the BBC reflecting, I would say, a centre-right bias, because the BBC is absolutely embedded within the establishment, and that was what the establishment was at that time.
But there is I mean, do we not all suffer to a degree? I don't, because I'm objective journalist and I'm brilliant. But do not many people, Jonathan, suffer from a bit of confirmation bias? I mean, you know Lewis Goodall, so perhaps that has an effect. I also happen to know Robbie Gibb, but I only know Robbie Gibb because I appeared on The Daily Politics with Andrew Neil a number of times, and all I remember about Robbie Gibb at that period was that he was supremely impartial. The programme was impartial. Andrew Neil, despite the fact that, you know, people have their own ideas, well, he's obviously a bit of a right-winger, but if you were an alien that came from another planet and knew nothing about him, you could watch 1,000 episodes of Daily Politics and you'd never work out whether he was left or right. Now, of course, Robbie Gibb was the editor of that programme and others for many years. So I would say he's completely impartial. I also, when I worked at the BBC, worked for alongside a producer who was to the left of Jeremy Corbyn, but was supremely impartial in ensuring, I mean, the biggest argument we ever had in an editorial meeting was her insistence that we must get Nigel Farage on the show because it's the only way to get proper balance. So that's my experience there, is that they were absolutely on the money when it came to balance.
As I say, I think it's absolutely possible to have political opinions and to work at the BBC and to work in positions where you need to be impartial. I think that Andrew Neil and Emily Maitlis are two of the best interviewers in the country, but he always knew exactly what they thought about things. Everyone's always known that Andrew Neil's on the right. Everyone's always suspected and now obviously know that Emily's on the left. But they were still very, very good interviewers, and they gave their own side, if you can call it that, as good as the other side. So I agree with you on that. I think that people have made specific allegations about Robbie Gibb, which I don't need to go into here. People can look at what Lewis Goodall has said about this, and they can draw their own conclusions. And they've accused him of being actually not impartial, of being subjective in his sort of pursuit of people at the BBC. Yeah. I think that you do need to have more confidence. People need to have more confidence in the BBC from both sides. And so the BBC does have more work to do on that particular issue. If we bring it back to the issue that we originally is the subject of this, which is the Trump Panorama programme, I actually don't think the BBC has a particular case to answer on that particular issue, because the thrust of what Donald Trump was saying was absolutely to rally the crowd into violence, and that is exactly what happened. Well, so much so that he was indicted for his role on the 6th of January, and he was indicted for his role in trying to steal the election in Georgia. Again, this is completely normal received wisdom at the time. Jonathan, obviously, there's been huge revisionism since then. I don't think the BBC has a case to answer on that.
Listen, I mean, the BBC didn't need to splice anything to make the argument about the then the then president's position, because I think anyone could extrapolate from that speech. I don't necessarily. I mean, he talked about being peaceful, but he certainly rallied the troops to get to the Capitol building. There's no doubt about that, and I thought it was a horrendous thing that Trump did, because although he didn't specifically say, let's get out there and have a scrap and cause mayhem and hope a few people die, it was an irresponsible position for someone like him to say. However, again, wearing two hats, nobody in journalism should be editing a clip to make it into one different, complete sentence. We can all agree on that.
I think that what they should have done was to make clear that it was a spliced piece of footage.
And there were many ways to do that.
Ian, as you know perfectly well, when speeches are relayed to people, the whole speech is not relayed verbatim, allowing people to draw their own conclusions. Editors do what editors do, they edit. They make speeches easy to digest, so the thrust of what is being said is made clear to the viewer.
Well, that made it sound like it was calling for violence. They didn't really. It's a separate discussion. I mean, they did make his words far more fundamental in the argument than they actually were. There was no.
I don't think
the context was removed.
It's not such a separate discussion, because we're really talking about whether the BBC is A, biased, B, fit for purpose. I think that the BBC is absolutely fit for purpose. But what I would argue the lesson of this particular episode is the BBC is far too fearful, far too deferential. They should have stood up much more to the allegations that Trump was putting forward, because basically Trump was saying he couldn't be defamed, that they defamed him, that obviously nothing of that kind happened. But everyone, basically everyone reasonable in 2021 agreed that is exactly what he had done. That's why he was indicted. That's why he was regarded as toxic for about 2 years after that election until his political comeback.
Yeah.
So this is I think there's a lot of revisionism about this.
Well,
the BBC,
there might be, but I
I
still think it's worth putting Panorama in the dock on that specific point. That is, as you say, the specifics of that for another day. Jonathan, great to have you on, sir. Thank you as ever. Jonathan Lis, political commentator. My own experience, and I've said it a ton of times, of working at the BBC, is that it was all, I mean, the meetings we used to have, and I wasn't there for very long, about half an hour in career terms, but the impartiality thing was, it was so laborious, as if like we were stupid. You'd sit there, whether you were presenting on your own or with a co-presenter, you think, you don't need to keep hammering this point. I am fully aware of what impartiality is. I know, the reason I'm in this world and in this job and you've hired me is because baked in to your hiring me is that I already know most of this. Nothing wrong with a reminder. I don't need a 3-hour meeting to tell me that, impartiality. So we had that was all the time. And having worked also on national programmes, like being on the Daily Politics and This Week, those kind of shows, and many others as well, that was always the case. And certainly when I mentioned the Andrew Neil show, of which Robbie Gibb was the editor of, there was absolutely zero sense of a political angle or try and hammer home this point. It was just the most balanced show by the most balanced editor in charge and presented by the most balanced journalist.